Joining us via Skype is Nic Spaull, an education researcher from Stellenbosch University. Nic, good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. So, the minister and the team that she's working with from NSFAS say, bar a few teething problems, the system is progressing well and it's actually sustainable. Is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the minister's announcement today is the latest installment, which has got to do with rising funding to higher education. So we heard in February when the budget was announced that there was an additional 57 billion rand that was allocated to higher education funding over the next 3 years. And I think there are a lot of people that are concerned about where that money is coming from and which the budget departments or budget lines have been cut in order to fund this higher education increase.
Yeah, and in fact, we have seen, of course, where there have been those cuts, but also we've seen some tax increases. But what about this issue of converting NSFAS from a primarily loan facility to primarily, a facility that provides bursaries? How is that working in the institution where you are and in neighboring institutions?
Yeah, so I think there are two things there. The first one is that converting something from a loan into a grant means that it becomes something which the government just has to pay with no expectation that money will be given back to it. So in terms of the government's balance sheet, it now needs to find that money because the loan is no longer an asset. The second major thing is that the grant of who qualifies for a NSFAS loan or the amount of family income was raised significantly. So now if you come from a family that has a combined annual income of less than 350,000 rand, you qualify, whereas previously the amount was much lower. So a larger number of students are qualifying. And I think that the big question is again, where that money is going to come from.
Sure. So a larger number of students are qualifying. What is the impact of that in the system?
The impact on the system is, I think that both this year and next year, we're going to see enrollment spikes or many students that want to attend university and TVET that won't be able to. The minister already announced that universities should stick to their enrollment targets and that even if there are more applications than they would normally take, they shouldn't take on those students. They should rather stick to their enrollment targets. And also to try and decrease dropout. I think this is another major announcement that the minister made, was that they're trying to introduce new programs to decrease the amount of dropout at university, which is a big problem.
So are you saying, Nic, that we're perhaps hurtling towards another crisis in the higher education sector, perhaps one that we didn't anticipate while trying to resolve issues of access for poor and working class students?
I actually think that we are hurtling towards another crisis, but I don't think it's in higher education. I actually think it's in basic education. If we look at basic education over the last 7 years, there's been a decline in purchasing power per learner of 8% per year. So we're already starting to see rises in pupil-teacher ratio, so you have more learners per teacher. And in the poorest 60% of schools, we have 48 learners per teacher. Whereas even 5 years ago, that was only 41 or 42 learners per class. So although higher education is receiving much more funding, this has been taken away from basic education, even things like the infrastructure grant, the school building program. Many of these things that affect many more students than those that reach higher education are receiving less funding. And it's important to remember that less than 10% of a cohort actually end up going to university, and less than 15% go to any kind of higher education whatsoever. So this is a very small percentage of the overall cohort that went to school, and it feels like we're throwing basic education under the bus so that we can fund higher education.
Yeah, in fact, you've in your writings, you've described that as the silent crisis in basic education, where you talk about, for instance, the fact that there were 670,000 more learners in 2016 than there were in 2010, yet the spending has been linked to inflation.
Yeah, so what's been happening in basic education is that the amount of money that's been allocated to basic education has only been going up by 7% a year for the last 7 years, whereas teacher salaries, which are the main driver of basic education expenditures, have been going up by more than inflation. And there was also a rise in births between 2003 and 2005 linked to the rollout of ARVs. So essentially what we have is a smaller amount of money per student, which we're starting to see in things like pupil-teacher ratios. We're starting to see in declines in the amount of infrastructure spending that's available per student. And that's really concerning because we're talking about millions and millions of learners, not just the ones that are getting to university and qualifying for NSFAS.
And all of this happening at the time, Nic, that we are talking about public sector wage negotiations, which are likely to lead to, significant increases in teacher salaries. But let's go back briefly to the issue of higher education. So in terms of, the system going forward, there's been this talk about the difficulties with the allocations being made by NSFAS and also the issues to do with the allowances of students. Do you foresee that being resolved in the coming months?
I mean, it's a big challenge to be seen whether the problems of NSFAS, whether they can be addressed within the timeframes that they've got. I mean, I've taught students before at universities, multiple universities, at least 2 or 3 universities in South Africa, where many of them would only be getting their government grants in June or July. So for 6 months of the year, when they have no family income to be drawing on, they have no way of paying for their food, paying for rent, or any of the other expenses that they experience. And I think the big challenge is to see whether or not the NSFAS system as a whole can be improved in its efficiency to manage such large amounts of money and large amounts of students. And as you say, we're heading into not just wage negotiations, but next year is an election year. Which means that university and teacher salary staff are likely to go up ahead of an election.
Just very quickly though, Nic, but this falls very much in line with what you believed to be a better model for free higher education than a free-for-all approach. I remember your writings around that in the years past.
No, definitely. I think that if we had said free education for everyone, including the rich, that would have been a terrible policy. So what we have now, where only those that have family incomes up to 350,000 get funded through NSFAS, is definitely a preferable policy to that. However, what I also advocated for was a government-backed loan that would only need to be repaid if you went into the labour market and earned a salary of, say, above 10 or 15,000 rand, which would have meant that there would be more money in the system to pay for those students without having to slash the budgets of things like early childhood development and basic education, because there's always a limited pot. So while this is a better policy than free higher education for everyone, I personally think that it's a worse policy than offering government-backed loans to all students that would only be repayable if they got a certain income level.
All right, thank you so much for that. Nic Spaull from Stellenbosch University, helping us navigate the tricky waters of funding for higher education as well as basic education.